At midnight, the hammer struck again. You hear it even before you see the tower, a rhythm that belongs to no human hand. Inside, shadows stretch into impossible shapes. Faces etched in stone watch every movement, your own reflection staring back older, terrified, and wrong. When you press your hand against the wall, expecting cold, you feel a heartbeat, alive, and it is yours, but not yours alone. You are not just an observer. The tower has claimed you. At midnight, the hammer struck against stone with deliberate insistence, each blow resonating through the frozen air of the village, carrying a vibration that crawled along rooftops and through the soil beneath cobblestones. The sound bent and stretched in impossible ways, folding back on itself until it became a mockery of rhythm and logic, a percussion that seemed both near and impossibly distant at once. Windows rattled in their frames despite the absence of wind, and the few shutters still hanging squeaked as though in protest, whispering their own complaints into the darkness. The tower had stood abandoned for decades, its blackened stones slick with moss and damp, ivy clawing upward like the fingers of something long dead. Yet every night the villagers swore they saw flickers of candlelight through the cracks, dancing across the broken panes in patterns too deliberate to be wind. Shadows moved where shadows should not, creeping along corners that ought to have been empty, stretching and twisting into impossible angles that made eyes ache and spines tense. The air around the tower carried a metallic tang that clung to lips and tongue, as if some unseen hand had left the taste of old blood and melted copper in the night itself, persistent enough to burn memory into the mouth long after the wind had passed. Even the animals sensed the disturbance. Dogs whimpered in their kennels, hooves clattered against cobblestones, and birds fell silent mid-flight, hovering in the black air with wings frozen, eyes fixed on the tower, as if seeing into something the villagers could not. The path leading to the entrance was slick with frost and decay, the stones beneath a thin film of blackened ice that reflected the faintest glimmers of light with a distortion that made familiar shapes monstrous, elongated, grotesque. No one had dared enter for years, yet every so often a sound echoed differently, a low rasp of movement inside the walls, as if someone, or something, walked the floors above and below simultaneously, treading in a rhythm not bound to human stride. The air inside the village seemed to thicken near the tower, carrying the scent of damp wood, scorched earth, and something older, sharper, a tang that pricked at nostrils and lingered in lungs like a warning. Sometimes, in the moments before the hammer struck again, the villagers thought they heard whispers, words folded into the stone itself, phrases they could not understand yet felt compelled to heed. Faint scratches marred the surface of the tower's stones, shallow lines etched into the walls that appeared overnight, forming patterns that suggested eyes, mouths, and faces frozen mid-expression, expressions that seemed to track movement from impossible angles. The wind, when it came, carried these impressions through the village, leaving a chill not of temperature but of expectation, as if the air itself conspired with the tower, bending reality in small, unbearable increments. From the hill opposite, the tower loomed like a sentinel of some unspoken verdict, black and slick against the clouded sky, a presence heavy and patient, feeding on the awareness it instilled. Lanterns swung in the empty streets, their flames sputtering despite the absence of breeze, shadows dancing in defiance of physics, stretching to meet the walls and retreating with a will of their own. Doors groaned on rusted hinges, some ajar, some locked, but all resonating with a hum that matched the hammer, vibrating through bone and nerve. By the time the hour ended and the hammer fell silent for a moment, a hush descended over the village that was thicker than sleep, heavy with the residue of fear and wonder, leaving the air taste bitter on tongues, leaving hearts pounding in ears, leaving a lingering sense that the tower, though abandoned, had never truly been empty. Curiosity drew the boldest up the mossed path, a narrow ribbon of stone half swallowed by ivy and fallen leaves, each step sinking slightly into centuries of decay, as though the tower itself measured their approach. The air was thick with the smell of damp moss, wet stone, and the subtle, almost imperceptible scent of burnt copper that clung to the crumbling walls like a warning. Branches and roots clawed at ankles, tugged at boots, resisting progress as if reluctant to allow entry. Yet the few who persisted felt an unseen guidance, a faint pull along the path that made hesitation impossible. Each footfall echoed, then returned in fragments altered by some unseen hand. Steps sounded heavier, longer, and then impossibly light, almost gliding, and the ears could not tell if it was their own stride mirrored or a ghostly mimicry. Upon reaching the tower, the door loomed, blackened and warped, with hinges rusted to the point of impossibility. Pushing against it revealed a resistance not purely mechanical, but almost organic, a subtle pushback that pressed into the chest as though the tower was aware of the intruder, weighing, assessing. Once inside, the air shifted, becoming warmer yet stale, carrying the metallic tang that seemed to coat lungs, throat, and tongue, lingering so persistently that swallowing became a conscious act, a reminder that the building had a presence that was not entirely empty, that it inhaled in parallel with the boldest who had trespassed into its domain. The walls were slick with condensation and age, stone polished by centuries of neglect and unseen hands, yet they bore new etchings nightly, their edges sharp and precise, forming faces that had never existed before, staring from niches and recesses as if waiting for recognition. Eyes followed every movement, wide, unblinking, and mouths held mid-expression, neither smiling nor frowning, capturing fleeting emotions the intruders had not yet felt, fears that had not yet been named, anxieties that had not yet arisen. Light from tallow lanterns struggled against shadows that refused to settle, pooling in corners and climbing surfaces where illumination should not reach, casting distorted reflections that multiplied the carved faces into impossible numbers, each one a whisper of intent, a suggestion of awareness that pressed on the mind like damp stone against skin. The hammering never ceased. It came from above, below, perhaps from within the walls themselves, resonating with a resonance that sank into chest and skull alike, vibrating in bones and teeth, so that the intruder felt both the source and the echo simultaneously, unable to separate action from reaction. Yet no hand could be seen, no craftsman revealed, no rhythm linked to flesh or reason, only the relentless insistence that filled the tower and all the corridors, moving in patterns both mechanical and deliberate, as if each strike was a sentence in a language the visitor could almost understand but never fully. Corridors twisted unnaturally, floors tilting just enough to unsettle balance, ceilings pressing low with subtle force that made backs tense, shoulders ache, foreheads brush against the stone despite attempts to remain upright. The air in these passages thickened in certain sections, moist and viscous, clinging to skin and hair, whispering against ears and throat, carrying a faint, sour odor reminiscent of old sweat trapped in cloth, but sharper, more intimate, like breath collected over decades. Each room held new carvings, intricate and impossible, figures that were neither alive nor fully inanimate, the edges of their forms shifting when not observed directly, subtle but perceptible in peripheral vision, suggesting movement, deliberation, intelligence. Sometimes, stepping back to examine a wall, an intruder would notice that a face once set slightly askew had adjusted in the absence of attention, a cheekbone more defined, an eyelid heavier, the impression that the tower recorded, remembered, and refined what it observed. Dust hung thick in the air, fine and persistent, catching lamplight to glitter faintly like suspended frost, coating hair and sleeves, settling in the corners of the mouth, leaving a subtle grit that carried the taste of stone, iron, and copper. The intruders could not dislodge it, and it lingered, a reminder that the tower claimed presence as surely as it claimed space. Floors bore markings that appeared overnight, lines that resembled footprints or tool scratches, sometimes human, sometimes elongated, impossibly narrow or wide, overlapping in chaotic patterns that suggested passage of others who had never existed, whose presence was implied but unverifiable. The walls themselves seemed to breathe, expanding slightly, contracting, subtle changes that created sensations of narrowing or lengthening corridors, distances that shifted, turning known routes into labyrinths without warning. Light behaved unnaturally, flames of lanterns flickering without draft, dimming as if starved, brightening in certain corners, shadows pooling where none should exist, and the edges of carvings softened or sharpened without apparent cause. In some chambers, figures crowded together in tight clusters, faces pressed against each other, expressions frozen yet intimate, as if observing each other in silent communication. These faces appeared overnight, precise in their placement, and occasionally resembled the intruders themselves, capturing likenesses with impossible accuracy, including details unnoticed by their owners: moles, scars, minute asymmetries. The hammering sometimes synchronized with heartbeats, rising and falling in rhythm that suggested consciousness, intelligence, intention. Each strike carried weight beyond metal and stone, as though it was a pulse, a statement, a presence embedded in the tower's very walls. Some intruders felt compelled to touch the carvings, to press fingertips into the cold stone, but the stone resisted, responding with subtle pressure or warmth, as though acknowledging contact, refusing separation, integrating the observer into its memory. Hallways seemed to elongate unnaturally with each step, corners deepening, light failing in patches, creating tunnels that repeated patterns yet never exactly mirrored previous paths. Those who lingered too long in one spot felt the pressure intensify, a subtle insistence, a weight that pressed along spine, shoulders, and nape, guiding posture and movement, bending the body to the architecture's will. Nights merged into days inside the tower, but time itself felt altered, moments stretching, folding, compressing. Intruders often emerged unsure if hours or days had passed, their own perception of length rendered unreliable by the tower's persistent rhythm. The relentless hammering, the breathing walls, the shifting carvings, the lingering metallic taste, and the oppressive, intimate air combined into a suffocating awareness that presence itself was observed, catalogued, and absorbed, leaving no corner of mind untouched. By the time the boldest emerged back into the open night, the path slick with frost and ivy, boots clinging to roots and stone, they carried more than fatigue. They carried impressions that clung to skin and memory, faces that followed in peripheral vision, echoes of hammer strikes in ears, taste of metal on tongues, and an undeniable certainty that the tower had already remembered them, had already begun shaping them into its own reflection, and would continue long after their retreat. The villagers began to avoid the tower altogether, moving along streets with lowered eyes and hurried steps. Yet the stories never ceased, whispered in markets and taverns, drifting from mouth to mouth, like smoke too thick to ignore. Those who dared climb the spiraling stairs and return brought back more than tales. They bore changes subtle but unmistakable, a tension in shoulders, a hesitation in gait, a weight in eyes that had witnessed angles and corridors no sane mind could have imagined. The spiral staircase itself seemed alive, each step uneven in ways that defied calculation, wood and stone shifting imperceptibly underfoot, forcing the climber to adjust posture constantly. Lean too far here, brace there, as though the tower measured the balance of their body, the precision of their footfalls, and recorded each micro-movement with patient intent. Rooms shifted between visits, corridors bending unnaturally, ceilings lowering just enough to leave faint marks across shoulders and foreheads, impressions that would not fade, that pressed on the body long after leaving the tower, an unspoken memory of intrusion. Mirrors and polished stone caught fragments of the intruder's reflections, distorted, elongated, faces older than their years, with eyes that carried histories of fear and wonder, mouths frozen in expressions that were neither their own nor entirely human. The walls themselves seemed to breathe, a slow rhythm that expanded and contracted in a cadence out of sync with any heart, a pulse that pressed against ribs and skull, that made the intruder aware of each inhale and exhale as though the tower itself were inhaling in unison. Faint scratches appeared overnight, new etchings of eyes, mouths, and faces pressed into stone with impossible precision, sometimes resembling the visitors so closely that it seemed as if the tower had captured the very soul, observing them in ways even memory could not reach. Dust clung to hair, sleeves, and skin, settling in corners of eyes and creases of neck, carrying the metallic tang that marked the air of the tower as old and attentive, the taste lingering on lips and tongue long after any meal, stubborn and insistent. Floors bore marks that were both familiar and alien, footprints that overlapped and diverged, elongated or impossibly small, leading into corners that had no exits, halting abruptly as if the tower decided to cease observation, only to resume elsewhere. Light behaved unnaturally. Candles flickered without draft, flames drawn towards certain carvings, shadows pooling in corners as if reluctant to obey, elongating or folding in on themselves in ways that altered perception, making the halls appear longer, narrower, and altogether alien to anyone who had known them the day before. Intruders felt drawn to faces etched in the walls, compelled to stare into eyes that mirrored not the present, but some accumulation of past visits, centuries of memory stored in stone, each gaze pressing against consciousness with subtle insistence. Some walls bore clusters of carvings, faces packed so tightly that they seemed to breathe together, expressions frozen yet fluid, mouths slightly curved, eyes focused on angles the visitor could not perceive directly, creating a sense of being surrounded by silent witnesses, recording presence with intent and patience that defied explanation. Sound shifted unpredictably, footsteps echoed with delays or in wrong directions, murmurs of voices warped and distorted, repeating words not yet spoken aloud, as if the tower anticipated thought and carried it back in a form slightly askew, just enough to unsettle the mind. Air changed density without warning, thickening in some corridors, thinning in others, brushing against skin with a faint, intimate pressure that seemed aware of posture and movement, tracking the slightest deviation from a straight path, recording each micro-adjustment. The intruder's own movements became unfamiliar, muscles learning curves and angles not dictated by the body, but by the architecture of the tower itself, as though the stone had begun to dictate motion, bending limbs, adjusting stride, forcing consciousness to negotiate with walls and ceilings that altered in response. Nights inside the tower lost meaning. Hours stretched and compressed unpredictably, leaving visitors unsure whether a single hour or a full day had passed, perception distorted by the relentless observation and subtle manipulation of space. Faces in mirrors and polished stone did not reflect true appearance, but a composite of intruder and tower, older, haunted, with eyes that carried the weight of corridors traversed, carvings observed, and hammering heard in the depths, a reminder that memory itself was mutable here, reshaped by the building's attention. The few who reached the upper chambers found rooms crowded with carvings that had multiplied overnight, each one sharper, more defined than the last, eyes aligned with unseen axes, mouths frozen in moments that had not yet occurred, as if the tower not only remembered the living but anticipated their fears and desires. Some attempted to mark these observations, scratching in corners or making notations in small books, only to find that markings shifted when turned away, words fading or rearranging, evidence of presence absorbed and rewritten, the visitor's own memory pressed into service of the tower as silent record. In moments of pause, intruders felt a presence behind them, not corporeal but palpable, an awareness that pressed into the back of the neck, shoulders, and chest, unrelenting yet subtle, like a weight distributed across the body in a pattern that matched the hallways, staircases, and chambers they traversed. The hammering below, faint yet insistent, seemed to sync with this presence, each strike a punctuation in a sentence written in stone and air, vibrating through bone and thought, shaping perception as the tower shaped itself in response. By the time the boldest descended to the village streets once more, the path slick with frost and ivy, boots soaked, and clothing dusted with stone, they carried more than exhaustion. They carried impressions embedded in muscle memory, senses attuned to angles and shadows that no one else could perceive, faces etched in peripheral vision that refused to vanish, echoes of hammering in ears, taste of metal on tongues, and an undeniable certainty that the tower had not merely witnessed them, but had begun to claim them, a subtle, patient incorporation into the geometry, memory, and relentless awareness that defined its ancient presence. A winter storm broke, lashing the village with ice and wind that clawed at roofs and rattled shutters. Yet inside the tower the air remained impossibly still, warm in contrast to the frozen chaos outside, carrying the persistent tang of burnt copper and ink that clung to tongue and throat like an old warning. Snow piled against the base of the walls, grinding against stone with each gust, yet it seemed to hesitate at the entrance, unable to cross the threshold, as if the tower had drawn a boundary, an invisible line that marked where the world ended and something else began. Shadows moved independently of light, detaching from corners and sills, climbing walls in defiance of physics, pooling in hollows as if alive, following unseen hands that traced intricate symbols into the stone, etching patterns into dust, into air, leaving impressions that lingered after the eyes moved on. Each symbol carried a weight beyond comprehension, a subtle insistence that pressed against the observer's mind, bending perception, compelling awareness to fold upon itself, so that every glance, every hesitation, became both record and reflection in the tower's patient memory. Those who lingered at the top floors found corridors that had no clear exit, staircases that twisted and folded, returning them to chambers they had not yet seen, or perhaps had always seen but could not remember, a geometry both familiar and alien, expanding and contracting with imperceptible deliberation. Floors shifted underfoot, tilting, softening, hardening, sending shivers up spines and shaking the perception of balance, forcing each step to negotiate not just stone and timber, but the tower's will, its awareness of each movement, each hesitation, each heartbeat. Windows, cracked and blackened by age, framed views that altered when glanced away from. Scenes outside frozen in impossible clarity, shadows stretching across snow and rooftops in ways that suggested motion beneath stillness, suggesting presences that could not exist in the mortal world. In these upper rooms, carvings had multiplied, pressing in corners and along walls, faces frozen mid-expression, mouths open in silent speech, eyes tracking angles that should not exist, every detail precise to a degree that unsettled memory, as if the tower had studied the observer and recorded minutiae invisible to ordinary perception. The air thickened in the higher chambers, subtle at first, clinging to skin, curling in hair, wrapping around limbs with a tactile insistence, each inhalation tasting of metal, ash, and a faint acrid sweetness, lingering in lungs as if the tower exhaled alongside those who dared ascend. Some intruders reported visions, brief flashes at first, fragments of self replayed in grotesque, distorted frames, watching themselves commit acts they had only feared, decisions taken they had never made, cruelty and indulgence pressed into awareness as though the tower had reached inside and plucked hidden potential from the marrow. Each heartbeat echoed hammer strikes from below, a rhythm that entered bone and skull alike, vibrating with a resonance that was neither entirely sound nor purely thought, a pulse that threaded through veins and nerves, leaving limbs tense, eyes wide, mind restless. Dust in these upper chambers moved subtly, curling and shifting even without draft, collecting in shapes reminiscent of letters or sigils, forming impressions that vanished when looked at directly, leaving only the faint sensation that something had been observed, recorded, and reshaped by the tower's subtle hand. Mirrors and polished surfaces reflected more than mere form, revealing elongated shadows, figures that leaned where none existed, faces older than the years carried by the intruder, with eyes carrying histories of rooms traversed, carvings observed, corridors measured, and hammering felt in the subterranean depths. Time behaved unpredictably. Minutes stretched into hours, hours folded into themselves, memories of ascent blending with the present into a single, ungraspable continuum. A glance down a staircase could show a descent that had never occurred or one that had repeated, the perspective of the intruder misaligned with geometry, impossible angles presenting themselves as natural, yet each one eliciting a tremor of unease. Those who paused to observe carvings too long felt subtle pressure at the nape of the neck, shoulders, and spine, a weight that was not physical but insistent, compelling posture and gaze in accordance with invisible rules, as if the tower corrected deviation, adjusted attention, reshaped consciousness. Faces etched in walls at these heights bore expressions drawn from the visitor's own fears, sometimes unrecognizable even to the observer, reflecting desires, doubts, cruelties not yet realized, each line and shadow carved with deliberate intimacy, an awareness of the self that the intruder had never admitted even internally. Some reported hearing whispers, indistinct at first, then clearer, words that mirrored thoughts not yet spoken, echoing off ceilings, sliding along walls, returning twisted and fragmented, carrying the weight of centuries of observation, a language understood only partially, enough to unsettle without revealing. Floors occasionally creaked in patterns, almost mimicry of the hammering, pulses of wood and stone vibrating in sequence, each movement registering in bones as memory and perception collided, reminding the observer that presence in the tower was both voluntary and already catalogued. At the highest points, the intruder could feel the geometry of the tower pressing in from all sides, walls that seemed closer than measurements allowed, ceilings that hung lower, hallways that narrowed subtly, guiding the body, shaping posture, bending attention. Shadows lengthened and shortened without external cause, climbing along carvings, tracing outlines of hands, lips, eyes, pressing the observer's own awareness against these forms until memory blurred with observation, until the self became one with the watched. When finally descending, forced by fatigue or unease, the intruders found the path back through corridors unrecognizable, staircases uncountable, chambers reshaped, a labyrinth that obeyed the tower's memory rather than human logic. Outside, the storm still raged, ice and wind tearing at the village, yet inside, each step toward exit felt monitored, calculated, remembered, and recorded in ways that no one could measure. Boots dragged through frost and snow, carrying dust, ash, and the metallic tang of the tower itself, skin tinged with warmth despite the cold outside, breath heavy, mind fractured by glimpses of visions, hammer echoes, and the unrelenting awareness that each movement, each thought, each fear had been noted and retained. By the time the villagers saw them again, posture altered, gaze distant, steps hesitant, there was a silence in their presence that was not mere fatigue, but the weight of memory claimed, of awareness incorporated, a subtle transformation wrought in ways neither understood nor entirely desired, leaving the onlookers with a sense of the tower's patience, its reach, and the intimate claim it made on those who dared ascend. Spring arrived with hesitant warmth, buds trembling on frost-bitten branches, yet the tower had grown silently, imperceptibly, its stones stretching upward and outward, warping geometry as if the seasons themselves obeyed its will. Windows no longer reflected sky or village rooftops, but captured the faces of villagers, layered in stone, expressions caught mid-scream, mid-laughter, some mouths open in silent terror, others twisted into grins that carried unholy knowledge, eyes following each passerby, as though the building consumed memory and refracted it back in endless detail. The hammering had escalated beyond rhythm or reason, a fevered insistence that resonated through timber and stone, crawling along streets, rattling shutters, shaking teeth and bones with every pulse, a vibration that seemed to map itself onto the nervous system of the village itself. Those who lingered at the edge of the courtyard felt it in chest and skull, a resonance that unsettled blood, drew sweat along the spine, and carried the faint, metallic tang of iron and dust into mouths, tongues, and lungs, leaving a persistent taste that neither cold spring air nor hurried meals could erase. Curiosity and obsession drew the bravest toward the tower despite the warnings etched in whispers, footsteps crunching over frost-melted snow, hands brushing against ivy and damp stone, hearts beating in patterns already known to the building, which had learned its audience over decades of silence and observation. Each ascent revealed corridors unfamiliar, yet intimately known, staircases that twisted and folded in ways that defied measurement, walls shifting imperceptibly to guide movement, ceilings pressing just enough to imprint memory onto skin, the geometry of the tower bending perception as much as gravity, creating a labyrinth alive with purpose. Faces carved in the walls multiplied with every step, more precise than ever, catching nuances that had escaped previous observers. Eyes aligned to track angles no mortal body could reach, mouths arranged in subtle mockery, silent whispers, and anticipatory gestures that recorded every hesitation, every glance, every breath, translating presence into permanence. Those who paused to study them too long felt pressure along the nape of the neck and shoulders, a subtle force nudging attention, molding posture, dictating sight lines, compelling the body to obey rules that the conscious mind could not comprehend. Dust shifted without draft, curling into shapes suggestive of letters, sigils, maps, impressions that could be read only in peripheral vision, vanishing when confronted directly, a language of observation encoded in absence rather than presence. The bravest who climbed did not return unchanged. Their reflections lingered behind in the walls, etched permanently alongside those already claimed, a fragment of self absorbed into the architecture, recorded in stone with meticulous care. Tools left behind were covered in fine dust that carried patterns not of work but of observation, gloves stiffened with residue that mapped veins and lines of the hand, and even boots bore impressions that mirrored steps yet to be taken, as if the tower had anticipated motion before it occurred. Sounds were transformed, each footfall multiplied into a chorus of echoes, some familiar, some distorted, carrying the tremor of hammering from deep within, creating a symphony of presence and absence, awareness and observation, a music that played across bone, stone, and sinew. Floors bore subtle alterations, small rises and dips that forced adjustments and balance, as if the tower rehearsed every step, recorded each micro shift, and returned it altered, a feedback loop of presence and influence, making intruders conscious of their bodies as instruments in a greater composition. Mirrors and polished surfaces no longer simply reflected form but projected possibilities, faces altered, older or younger, distorted in ways that suggested not mere vanity but memory, anticipation, and judgment, a layering of time upon space that left the observer unmoored. Rooms crowded with carvings pressed against the intruders, forcing glances to meet the eyes of those who had come before, bodies frozen mid-action, expressions captured in terror, joy, or incomprehensible satisfaction, the tower arranging these witnesses as though to interrogate each new arrival in silence. Climbing higher, one felt the resonance of centuries, the hammering below merging with vibrations through floors, stairs, and walls, threading into bones and nerves, echoing in pulse and breath, until presence became inseparable from memory, until observation was embedded within perception itself. Faces appeared where no wall had existed, reliefs emerging from stone with precision impossible for mortal hands, eyes tracking motion, lips holding half-smiles of secret comprehension, the tower's patience and calculation evident in every line, curve, and shadow. The bravest ascended despite fear, each step a surrender and an assertion, leaving behind not just tools but fragments of consciousness, portions of reflection, traces of will, the tower claiming them in silence, recording them in stone, integrating them into the geometry of its memory. Windows now framed endless eyes, each pane a repository of observation, each reflection a warning and an invitation, capturing not just those who entered but the entire village, layering images, memories, and presences into a mosaic that shifted subtly with every gust of wind, every fall of snow, every heartbeat that echoed along cobblestone and timber. By the time they emerged, if they emerged at all, boots dusted, skin tinged with warmth, breaths heavy and minds stretched, the village sensed the change, an alteration in gravity and sound, the resonance of hammering lingering in streets and hearts, a reminder that the tower had grown, claimed, and multiplied its reach, patient and unyielding, inscribing itself into flesh and memory with a precision that no spring, no sun, and no passage of time could diminish. By the following winter, the village lay beneath frost and snow, the wind scouring streets and roofs with relentless insistence, yet the tower remained, unchanged in form but impossible in perception, its stone exhaling cold and faintly metallic breath that carried across alleys and chimneys. The villagers no longer spoke of it directly, their lips sealed by habit, fear, and stories whispered in half-light. But on quiet nights, when the moon hung low and thin above frost-laden roofs, a soft hammering drifted across the village, measured and deliberate, vibrating through chimneys, rattling shutters, and threading through the bones of those who listened too closely. Shadows cast by moonlight aligned into impossible geometries, angles that bent against reason, stretching across walls and rooftops, forming shapes that should not exist, corridors traced in darkness that led neither forward nor back, and windows reflected interiors that seemed aware of every breath taken outside. The wind carried faint scents, metallic, acrid, and oddly sweet, hints of copper, ash, and something rotting yet alive, lingering on tongues and in hair, settling into coats and woolen collars with deliberate persistence, a reminder that the tower reached beyond its stone. Curiosity, slow burning and patient, consumed the last of the villagers who had resisted, whose nights had been restless with suppressed fascination, whose eyes had traced the tower from doorways and snow-packed streets, imagining stairs and chambers impossible to count, doorways that curved impossibly into themselves, windows that reflected not the outside, but something inside, something patient and attentive. He climbed the path through snow and frost, boots sinking into powder, ivy frozen and stiff, walls slick with ice, breath fogging in the thin winter air, yet the sense of being watched, of being anticipated, pressed against him like wind too cold to be natural. Every step inside felt preordained, corridors folding, ceilings bending, staircases twisting in ways that made orientation meaningless, each turn presenting chambers he could not remember entering, yet familiar with a precision that unsettled memory and muscle alike. The hammering was louder now, echoing through stone, timber, and air, vibrating in feet and hands, heart and skull, a rhythm that was neither entirely sound nor thought, resonating in the marrow, shaping awareness, leaving no point untouched. Walls bore faces more numerous than he had imagined, mouths frozen mid-scream, mid-laugh, eyes that watched from angles impossible for human perception, capturing minute shifts in expression, breaths, muscle tension, folding presence into stone, transforming observation into permanence. He noticed patterns, subtle at first, repetitions of lines and shadows that mirrored his own features, gestures, postures, traces of movement he had not thought he displayed. Yet there they were, etched with unerring precision, layered upon each other, multiplying across walls, ceilings, and staircases. Dust shifted without draft, curling into sigils and forms reminiscent of the lines of his own hands, feet, and face, vanishing when looked at directly, yet persisting in peripheral vision, a language of observation encoded in absence, compelling acknowledgement without articulation. Mirrors reflected more than form, elongating or compressing features, adding decades to hair and skin, altering eye shape and mouth line, projecting a self simultaneously known and alien, a reflection layered in the memory of the tower itself. Chambers pressed inward, corridors narrowed and lengthened without warning, doors and thresholds reappearing in places that denied linear time, geometry bending in ways that were intimate and deliberate, each adjustment a lesson in obedience, in recognition, in the necessity of awareness. Faces on walls seemed to anticipate his gaze, adjusting subtly, lips parting, pupils shifting, expressions responding to thought, desire, fear, and hesitation, transforming the observer into both subject and medium, an element in a tableau older than memory, larger than comprehension. The hammering slowed as he ascended higher, ceasing briefly in moments when he lingered too long, yet resuming with renewed insistence whenever movement occurred, a dialogue of presence, a counting of seconds, breaths, heartbeats, the pulse of awareness woven into the very fabric of stone. In the highest chambers, where light fell through fractured windows and thin shafts, he perceived his reflection differently, not as a mere image but as a repository, a likeness captured and replicated, each detail noted, each line of tension recorded, The shadow of self pressed into corridors, carved into thresholds, whispered into empty stairwells. Fear accumulated, not as panic but as recognition, a creeping comprehension that the tower was alive in ways that transcended breath and blood, that it remembered, anticipated, and responded, that each observation, hesitation, and movement had been claimed long before his arrival. And when he finally reached the topmost chamber, where the ceiling arched impossibly, collapsing angles into itself, the hammering ceased entirely. Silence pressed against him, not absence but presence, heavy with centuries, thick with attention, charged with the accumulated awareness of all who had come before, waiting, patient, deliberate. He pressed his hand against the cold stone, expecting resistance, texture, permanence. Instead, he felt warmth, the subtle thrum of a pulse beneath fingers, a heartbeat faint but undeniable, vibrating in time with his own, merging perception and memory into a single, inescapable rhythm. His eyes widened as he traced lines that were not carved, shapes that were not stone, corridors that bent impossibly around him, folding inward until he realized he was no longer merely observing but contained, entangled within his own likeness, mirrored infinitely across walls, floors, and ceilings. Each corridor became a reflection of himself, each step a duplication, each breath recorded in the geometry that twisted impossibly around him, the tower inscribing memory into form with deliberate patience. The hammering resumed, not as sound but as sensation, coursing through bone, blood, and sinew, a rhythm older than the village, older than memory, older than any known record of presence. His awareness fragmented, folding inward, until he could no longer distinguish self from stone, observer from observed, until the faint pulse beneath his fingertips became the only measure of existence, and he understood with a clarity that was at once exhilarating and horrifying. The tower had never been abandoned, had never slept, had never ceased to record, and in claiming him, it had completed another layer of its infinite, living architecture, patient, relentless, and holy. Awake,